Good evening and welcome to Back to Basics, Common Sense Law with yours truly, Preet Gill. At the last episode, we discussed you found the love of your life, you're planning the wedding of your dreams, but all of a sudden I come in and say, well, what about a prenup? You're saying, what is a prenup? Well, you worked so hard all your life, how are you going to protect your assets? So we discussed that, a lot of you say, well, why would I give the love of my life some contract such as a prenup that's going to say, hey, look, here's a contract. Even though I love you, you don't trust me. But the answer is a prenup, also known as a prenuptial agreement, has many benefits, okay? It doesn't mean that it's going to lead to divorce, and these are the things that you need to discuss. For example, I'm sure that a lot of you watching tonight do work as a family unit. That means sometimes you pool together mom's money, your cousin's money, hard-earned money from your family over the years, and you maybe built a business or you've done something that at the end, when you pass away, what will happen to that property? Is it fair that your spouse, who may have had nothing to do with this property, receives a portion of it? So a prenup agreement can also, state some of the agreements that you have, that this is what you're going to get at the time of death. The second benefit of a prenup is that it allows you to do some family planning, such as how to raise your children, okay? What kind of classes they want, what kind of religion they want to be raised in. And the third thing is, if you have a business, maybe your spouse does not want to be indebted for all the massive debts you have. So you can discuss, listen, these are my debts, I'm going to be responsible for them, you are not, you don't have to be responsible for them. So those are the benefits of a prenuptial agreement. Unfortunately, there's a time when some marriages will end up in divorce, okay? Whether it's just you wake up one morning and decide you don't like the person's face, or it could be something serious, as in, it's cruelty or abuse. So, there's different types of divorces, a contested divorce versus an uncontested divorce. In an uncontested divorce, it means that both spouses have agreed to divorce and have agreed to everything. There's no issue, there's no fighting. They've already decided between each other how to divide the property, the children's custody, everything. And contested divorces means that they're fighting. Maybe not over everything, but maybe small portions, like how much is the spouse supposed to get in support, or what days are the children supposed to come in, or who gets custody. So that's the difference between contested and uncontested divorces. Divorces are really interesting all over the world because, for example, in India, divorce rates are the lowest, but that's not because everyone's happily married. I could do a completely different show on that, but there are reasons. And in the Philippines, divorce is completely illegal. In the United States, 2/3 of the divorces that are filed by women. So, this is an ugly truth. This is something that we need to face because it can happen to many of us. So after the break, I have a great specialist, Ravi Cattry, who practices matrimonial law in New York State. So I will see you right after the break. Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing divorces. Divorces can happen for many, many reasons, and at times may not be the fault of either party. And relationships just come to an end. So why not, instead of ignoring this and say, I don't even want to learn about divorce, or I don't even want to talk about it, it's common sense to know some of your rights and know what to expect, because we don't know what's going to happen in the next minute, let alone 15, 20 years down the road. So today with me, we're going to have a specialist in New York State, Ravi Cattry, who was also here with us last week, and she discussed prenup, and she's from the offices of Elizabeth Freeberg. Thank you for joining us today, Ravi. I appreciate you coming back.
I'm excited to be back. Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you a question. How do you like doing matrimonial law?
Well, let me tell you, I'm never bored. Clients come in with, some interesting facts, some interesting cases, and I learn something every day, and I get to help people learn something new also.
I did it once, okay, and I swore. I ran out of the court saying that I'm never touching this again, because we spent about 4 hours, I'm not kidding, 4 hours trying to figure out what the value of a Prius was. Was it in good condition or excellent condition? And at the end, when we had to give this reporting to the judge, did you make significant process? No, yes, I don't know what to say. So, you know what? My hat's off to you, because I think matrimonial law is one of those areas where emotions get involved. It's not just a regular lawsuit where, you know, you're suing somebody and everyone goes their own ways. You know, you love this person, you may have had children with this person. So I really, my hat's off to all the matrimonial attorneys. So thank you for everything that you're doing. So let me ask you a question. I'm married, but what if one day I decide I want a divorce? And if my husband's watching this, I'm sorry, but what are my choices or my options?
So the first thing to determine is what are the grounds for divorce. In New York State, the most common ground for divorce now is what's called no fault, which is you and your husband are not getting along for a period of at least 6 months, and so you've decided that you want to divorce.
Okay, but what about, like, sometimes you hear, like, I don't know, Britney Spears or somebody just got married, or in the news, and all of a sudden they're not married in 2 days. Is there like a faster procedure than a divorce, or is there anything else besides? I mean, I always hear like different terms. So is there anything else that we should know about?
So another thing, that a way to terminate a marriage is called an annulment, but it's not necessarily faster. What it says is that the marriage never happened.
So what does that mean? I mean, I was there, they got married, and how did the marriage not happen?
It's the grounds for an annulment say that the reason that you're getting divorced is for some reason that makes the marriage invalid in itself.
Okay.
Whereas a divorce, you're going to be, okay, the marriage existed, but now we want to separate because of whatever reason.
Is fraud one of the reasons, maybe?
It can be.
Can you give an example of like what an annulment could be?
So an annulment could be somebody said, very common reason is, okay, somebody says they want to have children, and then they decide later that, no, I don't want to have children, and one party can say, I married you because of the promise to have children.
But so there's no time frame. I mean, annulment can happen like after 10 years of marriage?
It's unusual, but it can.
Okay, so but that's not a faster way to get divorced. It's just but legally it's important, because a divorce is you were married and then the divorce happened, right? But an annulment is as if it's been wiped clean, whereas if you were never married. But how do you report that in like taxes or immigration? Do you still say that you're married, or is that like a fact-by-fact scenario?
It's a fact-by-fact scenario. You know, depends if the divorce has been finalized yet, if it hasn't,
Okay. All
things
right.
like that.
So you were saying, so there's uncontested divorces, and then what other divorces are there?
So a divorce can be either uncontested or contested. And uncontested divorce is you've already agreed to amongst yourselves how you're dividing things,
Okay.
including property and care of children and custody of children.
So, and then what is a contested divorce?
A contested divorce is when you can't agree on something. So it doesn't have to be everything. You can, be agreed on, let's say, custody and child support, but you might not agree on who gets to keep the house.
So what are some of the grounds for divorce in New York State?
In New York State, you have adultery.
What that means that you...
If somebody had an affair.
Okay.
There's also abandonment, where one spouse just leaves the other spouse.
Is there like a time frame of how long the spouse has to be gone for?
It's approximately a year in New York.
Okay, so if they just one day get up and leave, that's abandonment.
Right,
Okay,
and it can also be cruel and inhuman treatment, where there's abuse, and that can be grounds for divorce also.
Okay, so I mean, and is there like a simpler way where you're not pointing fingers at your significant other? Is there another ground for divorce there?
It's called irretrievable breakdown,
Okay.
or no fault, which basically means it's not anybody's fault this marriage is breaking down. It's just, we can't get along, and that requires you not getting along with your spouse for at least 6 months.
So during the 6 months, is there a requirement that the spouses have to live together? Or, I mean, what do you have to show what kind of proof do you have to show that you guys are not getting along for 6 months?
The good thing about no-fault divorce is that you kind of just say, we haven't been getting along for 6 months.
Okay.
And that's about all the proof the courts need.
So you can continue to live together?
Yes.
Okay, so like in situations where maybe you're separated, even if you tried, like let's say, to go to therapy during that 6 month time frame, you can still show that you were separated?
Yes.
Why do a lot of people still continue to live in the same household?
It can be a lot of reasons. It could be one, it's easier to take care of the children if you're still living together, especially if children are younger. Mm-hmm. It could also just be financial reasons, where you can't really afford to pay for 2 properties, 2 rents, because your finances haven't been divided yet and your assets are still joint.
So why would one person, if no fault is so easy or easier to prove, how come sometimes you hear that a husband or wife has filed a divorce and they're asking for a fault base such as adultery or abandonment or cruel and inhumane treatment. So
it can depend. Like for, let's say, immigration reasons, you might need cruel or inhuman treatment in order to maintain your status in the United States, whereas for somebody else, no fault is fine because all you want to do is terminate the marriage.
Well, I just want to do a quick caveat. I know we're talking about matrimonial, but you did touch a good point about immigration. So that's actually, you're right. If you do have a finding of cruel and inhumane treatment, it may help with your immigration. But, a lot of the times you don't need to show that, as long as, a lot of the times people get like a 2-year green card where you got the green card because you were married, but now immigration wants to take another look to make sure that you had a real marriage, but you had a divorce. So the misconception at that point is that you don't actually have to show that you were abused, although you can, but you can just show that you can still do the uncontested, no-fault divorce and still be able to extend your green card, and we'll do a completely different show on that. So, okay, so then you're saying that the reason why a lot of people use these at-fault grounds is as like maybe negotiation for certain things, or?
Sometimes it can be, let's say if you had a prenuptial agreement, which we covered on our last show.
Right.
If there was a clause about adultery, that if one party commits adultery, then the agreement doesn't have to be followed. Maybe you want to prove adultery grounds for that reason. I
mean, divorce law sounds, just litigation in itself sounds pretty expensive. I'm pretty sure you don't do everything for free, right? So like, how does that affect an individual? Let's say that one spouse may just have been the stay-at-home mom, right, that didn't work and doesn't have a job or the means to pay an attorney, and then your husband, like, I'm being typical here, husband, wife, I'm sorry, okay, but it's just an example. So like, let's change it around, okay? You're the stay-at-home dad and your wife has a great job and she can afford a really expensive attorney, but you can't. Isn't that a little unfair in the process?
So the good thing is, in New York State, the laws are set up so that if you can't afford an attorney, you can make an application to the court for the other spouse, who is the more moneyed spouse, to pay for your attorney. Okay,
so that means that the step to seeing how much you want to fight this divorce is really important, especially if you have more money than your spouse, because you could be ordered to pay their legal fees. But sometimes that's not fair, because what if the person who, let's say, doesn't have the money knows that the richer spouse is going to pay for their attorneys? Isn't that an incentive for them to not settle and just continue to litigate the divorce?
The court, when assigning counsel fees, will take a look at, is one party being unreasonably dilatory in finalizing the divorce. So if somebody's delaying too much, that will count against them. So it benefits everybody to try to get it done quickly, as much as possible.
Okay. So in New York State, which court do you go to in order to file for divorce?
So it's confusing because there's a Supreme Court and Family Court, and Family Court does not do divorces.
Okay.
So you have to go to Supreme Court in order to do your divorce.
But in New York, Supreme Court is not the highest court, right?
Correct.
Why do they do that? It's so confusing. I remember in law school and I was like, aha, Supreme Court, but I realized in New York State it's actually the lowest level of the trial level.
Correct.
Okay, so the divorce. So do you have to go to two different courts? Like, if you have children, do I have to go to Supreme Court for the divorce and then Family Court for the issue of the children? I mean, that seems pretty hectic.
Supreme Court will handle everything when it comes to divorce, whether it's children, property, support, all of that's done. If you actually have started something in Family Court, you can transfer it into Supreme Court as part of the divorce.
From your experience, what has been the longest divorce case that's been pending?
Oh, my firm just finished a trial for a divorce case that started in 2010. So
9 years, almost 10 years?
9 years, and the judgment hasn't officially been signed yet, so
they
it'll
must
probably be...
really love each other.
Yeah, after a while, there's a different kind of love.
I mean, so what? I know you're not allowed to talk, but what are some of the common issues that you see between spouses? Like, what are some of the common fights that they have or disagreements?
Sometimes, where issues of business ownership, which in the case I was discussing, that creates a problem about, okay, who has contributed how much, when did the business start, how much is the spouse who hasn't really worked in it but just been raising the family during this time is entitled to that a portion of that business.
So let me ask you another question, just from your experience, okay? Have you noticed that the couples who had a prenuptial agreement before they got married and now we're in divorce, do you think that those divorces are slightly smoother than the ones that didn't have any sort of an agreement with one another?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
You know, you'll see, you know, these people have already discussed it, they know, and there's rarely really a reason to fight over things because everything's already decided.
Unless somebody objects to the
validity of the agreement.
Wow. So, okay, so maybe if we have a little bit of time, we can discuss some of the things that are, you know, you touched on equitable distribution. So, like, what is, in a divorce, like, what is fair game? Like, what, if I own, you know, my phone, my ring, and these are all the things that I bought, maybe a signed autograph of Priyanka Chopra, I don't know, somebody, right? Like, I got all these things during the marriage, now these are mine, right?
Anything bought during the marriage is marital property, and you two have to split it.
That's not fair. Okay, so that's what the prenup is for. So how do you split? Like, how do you split an asset? Like, do you have to then sell it, or do I have to buy off my spouse, or like?
It can be, you know, if it's a house, it's a little bit easier. You know, one party may buy out the other party's interest, and you refinance if there's a mortgage there. Sometimes you might just sell, and so each of you move into something smaller. It depends on the asset you're.
What happens if a spouse, for example, they, you know, husband and wife have this massive house, they've been living there, and now they're going for divorce? Like, who determines which spouse gets to stay in the house and the other one has to leave? I mean, or is that something that the court decides, or is there like some sort of a standard on how this is decided?
It depends, like everything else in divorce.
Okay.
If they're children of the marriage who are under the age of 18, the parent that has primary custody of the children may want to remain in the house until the youngest child turns 18. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you know, maybe the husband wants to stay because he can afford it, or, you know, whichever the moneyed spouse.
Okay. So, I mean, that was a lot of information, and I think that, you know, matrimonial can sometimes become very detailed, very factually based. And so, you know, the common theme, again, I keep saying this, is that's why documents such as prenups, just like any other contract, right? The real estate contract, the contract to buy a business, whatever it is, it's the same contract that says, look, you know, you and I are about to make a very important decision that's not only going to affect us, but it's going to affect our loved ones, our children, our family. Why not put this in writing so that we are not spending money on attorneys as much as we would love your business as attorneys, okay? But, you know, spend your hard-earned money on 10 years of litigation, right? And I'm sure that that was not the longest. I'm sure there's been other divorces, right?
Absolutely, there are other divorces. You know, divorces can go on for a long time.
And it's a disaster sometimes because, you know, you have children involved and then they're being put through all of this stuff. So, you know, again, it is important to get a prenup, but for those of you that don't have it, it's still important to see what your rights are, what your responsibilities are, and I guess what, just not be too emotional.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. You be emotional. Let us deal with the facts.
Yeah, fair enough. So I guess next week we're going to dive into a little bit more specific details about issues of child custody, spousal support, maintenance, child support. So we've learned so much, Ravi. I really appreciate you coming and giving us a little bit of information into divorces in New York State. I always tell people that are watching that are outside of New York State, even though we're giving you our best to give you a general knowledge, please always talk to an attorney in your state. So I'll be right back after the break, and I hope you have some questions. Welcome back. We learned so much today from attorney Ravi Cattry. We learned that there's actually a menu of options that you can choose when trying to end a marriage. There's different types of divorces, such as contested versus uncontested. Uncontested meaning that you're agreeing to everything, and contested means you're going to fight about a couple of things with your spouse. And there's different grounds for divorce, such as, you know, adultery if your spouse had an affair, abandonment, cruel and inhumane treatment, where if you've been subject to abuse. But then there's also easier grounds for divorce, which is a no fault, saying, hey, it's not your fault, it's not my fault, we're not blaming fingers, putting fingers on each other. But for the past 6 months, we have been separated, even if you're still living together, because that's important. There's nothing that requires, at least in New York State, for you to live separately. It's just for 6 months. the relationship has not worked and now we need to go our separate ways. So in a divorce, there's a couple of things to determine. The first thing, obviously, you're getting divorced, okay? If one party says, I don't want the divorce, well, guess what? You're gonna get the divorce. So let's put that emotion aside, all right? The other things that that a divorce is going to determine, if you already have not decided these things with your spouse, is if you have children, the custody of the children, who's gonna have primary custody, where are the children gonna live, where are they going to go to school, who's going to see them on the weekends, how are you going to share the custody of your children, do you get the summers, does the person get Christmases? Like, these are all really important things that are going to be decided, and if you can't, take the time to work it out with your spouse, a court will decide. The other thing that in a divorce that gets decided is child support. How much are you going to pay your spouse to support the children? And sometimes that goes beyond just them being 18 years old. It can go further if the child goes to college. And some of the other things is, how do you distribute property? And property, just because you think you purchased something by yourself during your marriage, may actually be fair game for your spouse to say, I want 50% of the value of that. So there's a lot of legal issues. And the one final point that I wanted to make is, for those of you that may be at home and say, I need to get out of this relationship, but I don't have the financial ability to hire an attorney. One of the things that we learned from Ms. Cattry was that if your spouse makes more money than you and can afford it, the court may enter an order making them pay for your legal fees, because there has to be fairness somewhere. So we learned a lot, and next week we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of these complex issues to figure out how they're decided. So I hope you guys enjoyed the show, and I will see you guys back next Thursday live at 7:30.